At 9:47 a.m. on July 14, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen III crouched beside a battered M4 Sherman tank in a French apple orchard, watching General Omar Bradley climb out of his Jeep to inspect a device that every engineer in the European theater had called impossible. 29 years old, former window dresser from New Jersey, zero engineering credentials. The device, welded to the front of the Sherman, looked like something from a fever dream. 4 massive steel prongs, each cut from German beach obstacles, jutted forward like the tusks of some prehistoric beast. The tank crews had already given it a name. They called it the Rhino. 5 weeks earlier, the Allied invasion of Normandy had stalled in the hedgerows. 150,000 American soldiers were trapped in a nightmare landscape that no training exercise had prepared them for. The bocage country of Normandy consisted of ancient farming fields surrounded by earthen walls up to 15 feet high, crowned with centuries of tangled vegetation. The hedgerows had been there since Roman times. They were not bushes. They were fortresses. The Germans understood this terrain perfectly. They dug foxholes directly into the hedgerow walls. They positioned machine guns to cover every gap between fields. They waited for American tanks to attempt the only apparent option: climbing over the top. When a Sherman tried to breach a hedgerow by driving up and over, 3 things happened simultaneously. The tank's belly armor, barely an inch thick, became exposed to German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. The tank's gun pointed uselessly at the sky, and the tank became a stationary target for the Wehrmacht soldiers watching from the next hedgerow 300 yards away. American tankers had a name for this moment. They called it the death climb. The casualty figures told the story. In the first 3 weeks after D-Day, the 7th Corps alone lost 40,000 men, not to massive armored battles, not to Luftwaffe bombing raids, to hedgerows. Field by field, row by row, the American advance ground to a halt against walls of earth and vegetation that predated the Roman Empire. The men who survived those weeks never forgot the sound. The distinctive whoosh of a Panzerfaust rocket leaving its tube. The half-second of silence before impact. The explosion that turned a Sherman tank into a crematorium. Tank crews learned to listen for that sound the way infantry learned to listen for incoming artillery. But listening did not help. By the time you heard the Panzerfaust, it was already too late. The Germans had perfected their defensive tactics over 4 years of war. They knew exactly where American tanks would appear. Every gap in the hedgerows was pre-registered for mortar fire. Every sunken road was covered by machine gun positions dug into the embankment walls. The Wehrmacht soldiers waited in their foxholes, invisible, patient, watching the Americans die one field at a time. Sergeant Thomas Reynolds of the 743rd Tank Battalion described a typical hedgerow assault in his after-action report. His platoon approached a wall at 0730 hours. The lead Sherman began its climb. At the moment of maximum exposure, 3 Panzerfaust rockets hit it simultaneously. The tank brewed up the tanker's term for catastrophic fire. 4 men died inside. The 5th, the bow gunner, managed to escape through the hull floor hatch. He survived with burns over 60% of his body. Reynolds' platoon took that field. They lost 2 more tanks doing it. The next field looked identical. They would have to do it again. General Bradley later wrote that the bocage fighting was the most frustrating experience of his military career. His armored divisions, designed for rapid offensive operations across open terrain, were reduced to infantry support in a landscape where tanks could barely move. The great American advantage, the ability to mass armor and break through enemy lines, was useless when every field was a fortress and every hedgerow was a wall. The problem seemed unsolvable. Combat engineers tried explosives. A single hedgerow required 50 pounds of TNT to breach, and the blast announced the attack to every German position within a mile. They tried bulldozer tanks. The Army had exactly 4 bulldozer-equipped Shermans per division, nowhere near enough to clear a path through terrain where every field required a new breach. They tried having infantry dig gaps with shovels, while tanks provided covering fire. This worked slowly, at the cost of men who died while digging. The Army's official solution was to accept the casualties and push forward anyway. The hedgerows would eventually end. The open tank country around St. Lo beckoned just 20 miles to the south. All they had to do was fight through the bocage, one bloody field at a time. Military planners estimated this would take until September. By then, the summer fighting season would be over. The war would drag into 1945, perhaps 1946, perhaps longer. Curtis Cullen was not a military planner. He was not an engineer. Before the war, he had worked for Schenley Distillers in New York City, arranging window displays and computing decoration costs. His military experience began in 1938 when he joined the New Jersey National Guard, a cavalry unit called the Essex Troop. They had trained on horseback, held riding exhibitions, and considered themselves elite. Then the army mechanized them, replaced their horses with tanks, and shipped them to England to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Cullen landed in Normandy with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division, shortly after D-Day. His job was to scout ahead of the main force, find the enemy, and report back. In the bocage, scouting meant driving into ambushes. The hedgerows channeled every vehicle onto sunken roads that became kill zones. German anti-tank guns covered the road intersections. Machine gun nests waited at every bend. Cullen watched friends die in the first week. He watched more die in the second. The frustration built throughout June. Every night, tankers gathered to complain about the hedgerows. Every morning, more Shermans climbed the earthen walls and died with their bellies exposed. The crews talked about solutions, wild ideas most of them, flamethrowers to burn through the vegetation, rockets to blast gaps, chains to pull the hedgerows apart. None of it was practical. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. The tanks could not stay level while breaching the walls. If you want to see how a window dresser from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled the entire U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Cullen. The idea came from a private named Roberts, a Tennessee man, not much education, the kind of soldier that officers overlooked in planning meetings. During one of the nightly complaint sessions in late June, Roberts spoke up. His solution was simple, absurdly simple. Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges? The other men laughed. The hedgerows were not bushes to be trimmed. They were walls of compacted earth, stone, and root systems that had been growing for 1,000 years. You could not cut through them any more than you could cut through a medieval fortress. Roberts shrugged and said nothing more. Cullen did not laugh. He had worked with displays, with materials, with the practical problem of making things fit where they were not supposed to fit. He understood that sometimes the obvious solution was obvious for a reason. That night, he started sketching. The mathematics of the hedgerow problem were straightforward. A Sherman tank weighed 33 tons. When it drove up a hedgerow embankment, the front of the tank rose while the rear stayed on the ground. This created an angle of approximately 60 degrees at the moment of maximum exposure. The tank's belly armor faced the enemy. The tank's gun pointed at the sky. The tank's engine strained against gravity. The crew was helpless for 8 to 12 seconds while the tank crested the wall and crashed down the other side. Those seconds were enough for a German soldier with a Panzerfaust to destroy the tank and kill everyone inside. But what if the tank did not climb? What if instead of riding up the embankment, the tank plowed through it? The hedgerow walls were formidable, but they were not solid stone. They were earthen roots and accumulated debris. A 33-ton vehicle, moving at 10 miles per hour, generated enormous kinetic energy. If that energy could be focused at the base of the wall, rather than dissipated in an upward climb, the tank might be able to punch straight through. The problem was keeping the tank level. When the Sherman's front end hit the hedgerow, the natural tendency was for the tracks to grip the embankment and drive upward. The tank wanted to climb. Something had to prevent that climbing motion, had to force the nose down into the base of the wall instead of up and over it. Cullen remembered the German beach obstacles. The Wehrmacht had planted thousands of steel barriers along the Normandy coast to destroy Allied landing craft. Most were variations on a design called the Czech Hedgehog. 3 or more steel beams welded together at right angles, creating a multi-pointed obstacle that would tear open the hull of any boat that hit it. After D-Day, these obstacles were useless. They littered the beaches, waiting to be collected as scrap metal. The steel beams were heavy, solid, and pointed, Cullen realized that if he welded several of these beams to the front of a Sherman, angled downward, they would dig into the base of a hedgerow when the tank moved forward. The prongs would anchor the nose of the tank, preventing it from climbing. The tank's engine, instead of pushing the vehicle upward, would push it straight ahead through the wall. It was not engineering in any formal sense. It was intuition. A window dresser's understanding of angles and materials, and the way objects behaved when force was applied. Cullen found a maintenance sergeant who could weld. Together, they cut 4 prongs from a captured hedgehog, each about 4 feet long. They welded a crossbar to the tank's front armor and attached the prongs at a downward angle. The whole assembly added perhaps 200 pounds to the tank's weight. The first test was conducted on July 5, 1944, in a field near the village of Lecambe. Cullen's modified Sherman lined up facing a hedgerow that looked like every other hedgerow in Normandy. 8 feet of packed earth crowned with brambles and small trees. The roots of those trees and bushes had been growing for centuries, interweaving into a dense mat that held the earthen wall together like natural reinforcement. A small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the maintenance section that Sergeant Cullen had built something, that he claimed it could breach hedgerows without climbing them. Most of the watching soldiers were skeptical. They had seen too many failed solutions. Engineers had tried everything from explosives to cable dragging to hand digging. Nothing worked fast enough, safe enough, or reliably enough to matter. The driver was a corporal from Ohio whose name has been lost to history. He sat in the Sherman's hull, hands on the control levers, staring through his periscope at the hedgerow wall ahead. The steel prongs jutting from the front of his tank looked crude, improvised, almost ridiculous. They were bolted to a crossbar that had been welded to the transmission housing. The welds were rough. The alignment was imperfect. Everything about the device suggested desperation rather than engineering. Cullen stood to the side, close enough to see, but far enough to survive if the tank flipped or the device failed catastrophically. His hands were shaking. He had worked on this for a week, but he had never seen it tested against a real hedgerow. The mathematics suggested it would work. The physics suggested it would work. But the bocage had defeated more sophisticated solutions than a few pieces of scrap steel. The driver revved the engine. The Sherman's 400 horsepower Ford GAA roared. Black exhaust poured from the rear deck. The tank lurched forward, accelerating toward the hedgerow at approximately 10 miles per hour. The steel prongs hit the base of the wall. For one terrible moment, nothing seemed to happen. The tank's nose did not rise. The tank did not climb, but the tank did not break through either. It just pushed against the ancient fortification, engine screaming, tracks churning. Then the hedgerow exploded. Dirt and roots and centuries of accumulated vegetation flew in all directions. The Sherman burst through the wall like it was crashing through a paper screen, emerging on the far side under a canopy of debris. Clods of earth rained down on the tank's hull. Branches and root fragments scattered across the field. The tank never climbed. The tank never exposed its belly. The tank simply drove straight through as though the ancient fortification was nothing more than an inconvenience. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the watching soldiers started cheering. The men could not believe what they had seen. One moment, the hedgerow was an impenetrable barrier that had stopped the entire Allied advance. The next moment, there was a Sherman-sized hole in it, and a tank on the other side, ready to fight. Cullen's legs gave out. He sat down in the French grass and stared at the hole in the wall, trying to understand what he had just accomplished. Word spread through the 2nd Armored Division within hours. Other crews wanted the modification. Other sergeants wanted to know how it was done. By July 10th, several units were cutting up beach obstacles and welding prongs to their Shermans. The devices were not standardized. Some had 4 prongs, some had 6, some angled more steeply than others, but they all worked. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley arrived to see a demonstration. Bradley commanded the 1st United States Army, over 300,000 men. He had spent 5 weeks watching his forces bleed against the hedgerows, while the planned breakout operation, codenamed Cobra, was delayed again and again. The bocage was destroying his timetable, his casualty estimates, and his confidence. He had come to this orchard because one of his subordinates, Major General Leonard Jarrow, had telephoned that morning with news of something extraordinary. Bradley climbed out of his jeep and walked toward a group of officers clustered around a light tank. The tank had been modified. A crossbar was welded to its front, and from that crossbar protruded 4 steel prongs, each roughly 4 feet long, angled downward like tusks. Bradley studied the device. It looked crude. It looked desperate. It looked like exactly the kind of improvisation that usually failed. Jarrow explained the theory. The prongs would dig into the base of the hedgerow, preventing the tank from climbing. The tank would push straight through instead of going over. A sergeant named Coulin had invented it. The sergeant was standing nearby, watching Bradley with the nervous expression of an enlisted man whose career might depend on the next 60 seconds. Bradley stood in the French orchard and watched a Sherman tank line up against a hedgerow. The tank was equipped with Coulin's device. 4 steel tusks protruded from its front armor, giving it the appearance of some armored prehistoric creature. The engine revved, the tank accelerated, the hedgerow disintegrated. Bradley watched in what observers later described as awe. The tank did not climb. The tank did not expose its vulnerable underside. The tank simply plowed through the obstacle that had stymied the entire American war effort in Normandy. Dirt showered down. Branches flew. The wall that had stood for 1,000 years was gone in 3 seconds. Bradley turned to his staff. His face had transformed. The exhaustion and frustration of 5 weeks had been replaced by something else. Hope. He immediately recognized the implications. If every Sherman in his army could breach hedgerows like this, the bocage was no longer a death trap. It was just terrain. The breakout could happen on schedule. The war could be won in 1944. He ordered immediate mass production. Every ordnance unit in the First Army was assigned to round-the-clock fabrication of what the soldiers were already calling rhino devices. Scrap metal came from the same German beach obstacles that had once been intended to stop the Allied invasion. Now those obstacles would enable the breakout. The logistical challenge was immense. Bradley wanted 3 out of every 5 tanks equipped with the device before Operation Cobra launched. That meant manufacturing over 500 Rhino assemblies in less than 2 weeks. The welding equipment available in France was insufficient. On the evening of July 14th, a plane was dispatched to England to retrieve additional arc welders. It returned before breakfast the next morning. Trucks were waiting at the airstrip. Maintenance crews worked in shifts, cutting steel beams, welding crossbars, fitting prongs to tank after tank. The devices were not identical. Field conditions made standardization impossible. But they did not need to be identical. They just needed to work, and they worked. By July 25th, 1944, the first day of Operation Cobra, over 60% of First Army Shermans were equipped with Coulin's hedgerow cutters. The tanks that had been dying by the dozens now crashed through the bocage, like charging rhinoceroses. The name stuck: Rhino tanks. Coulin's devices. The breakout from Normandy had begun. The morning of July 25th dawned gray and overcast. American bombers had pounded German positions for hours, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on the defensive lines around St. Lo. Some bombs fell short, killing American soldiers, but the main German positions were devastated, and then the Rhino tanks moved forward. Staff Sergeant William Carter of the 2nd Armored Division later described what it felt like to breach his first hedgerow with Coulin's device. "We'd been dying on those walls for weeks," he said. "Every time we climbed one, we knew we might not make it over. Then they welded those tusks on my tank and I drove straight through. The wall just came apart. Dirt everywhere, couldn't see nothing for a second, and then we were on the other side and the Germans were running. They weren't ready for tanks to come through the walls. They had their positions set up to kill us climbing over, not busting through." The American advance accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. Hedgerows that had taken hours to breach now fell in seconds. Tank platoons that had been losing 1 or 2 vehicles per field now crashed through multiple walls without casualties. The careful German defensive grid, built over weeks of preparation, collapsed as American armor appeared in places it was never supposed to reach. The German response to the Rhino tanks was confusion, followed by desperation. Wehrmacht defensive doctrine in the bocage depended on the predictability of American attacks. Every hedgerow was a killing ground because every American tank had to climb over it, exposing itself for those critical seconds. Machine gun positions were sited to cover the gaps where American infantry might try to breach the walls. Anti-tank weapons were positioned to fire on Sherman bellies as they crested the embankments. The Rhino devices destroyed this entire defensive system. German soldiers in their hedgerow foxholes suddenly found American tanks bursting through the walls beside them, behind them, in places where no tank was supposed to be able to go. The carefully prepared kill zones became death traps for the defenders instead of the attackers. Machine gun crews were crushed under falling debris or run over by Shermans before they could reposition. Mortar teams found their pre-registered coordinates useless when tanks emerged from unexpected angles. Oberleutnant Friedrich von der Heide, a German paratrooper commander who fought in the Bocage, later described the shock of encountering the Rhino tanks. His men had been confident in their positions, protected by hedgerows that had stopped every American attack for weeks. Then the walls started exploding. Tanks appeared where tanks could not exist. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who had held their ground against infantry assaults and artillery bombardments began retreating from positions they had considered impregnable. The breakthrough at St. Lo came faster than anyone had predicted. Operation Cobra, originally expected to take weeks of grinding combat, achieved its objectives in days. American armored columns poured through gaps in the German lines. The Bocage, which had threatened to extend the war by months, was behind them. Ahead lay the open terrain of central France, ideal for the kind of mobile warfare the American army had been designed to fight. Curtis Cullen received the Legion of Merit for his invention. The citation praised his initiative and ingenuity in developing a device that significantly contributed to the success of Allied operations in Normandy. He was promoted and continued to serve with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron through the summer and fall of 1944. But Cullen never forgot where the idea had come from. In interviews after the war, he repeatedly tried to give credit to Private Roberts, the Tennessee man who had first suggested putting saw teeth on the tanks. Cullen had merely taken Roberts' joke seriously, worked out the engineering, and built a prototype. The invention belonged to both of them, or perhaps to the collective frustration of every American soldier trapped in the hedgerow nightmare. The publicity machine did not care about Private Roberts. War correspondents wanted a single hero, a story that could be told simply. American sergeant defeats ancient fortifications with Yankee ingenuity. Cullen's name appeared in newspapers across the United States. Roberts' name appeared nowhere. The Tennessee private returned to obscurity, his contribution forgotten, even as the devices based on his idea helped win the war in Europe. President Eisenhower later spoke about Cullen in a 1961 address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. "There was a little sergeant," Eisenhower said. "His name was Cullen, and he had an idea." The president described how Cullen's invention had transformed the Normandy campaign, how a simple concept rejected by engineers had proven more valuable than all the formal solutions developed by military planners. What Eisenhower did not mention was what happened to Cullen 4 months after his moment of triumph. The Hurtgen forest was nothing like the Bocage. Instead of ancient hedgerows, American soldiers faced dense woodland, steep ravines, and German defensive positions that had been prepared for months. The fighting began in September 1944 and continued into the winter. It became the longest battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II. It also became one of the bloodiest. Over 33,000 Americans would be killed, wounded, captured, or succumb to combat exhaustion in those dark woods. Cullen's reconnaissance squadron entered the Hurtgen in November. The skills that had served them in Normandy were useless in the forest. Tanks could not maneuver between the trees. The Rhino devices that had broken the hedgerows could not break through dense woodland. The forest floor was a maze of ravines and streams that channeled movement into predictable paths. And the Germans had prepared those paths with the same methodical efficiency they had applied to the Bocage. Cullen and his men fought as infantry, dismounted, struggling through terrain that negated every American advantage. The trees burst when artillery hit them, spraying wooden shrapnel in all directions. The fog and rain reduced visibility to yards. Units got lost. Radio communications failed in the dense vegetation. Men wandered into German positions without knowing they had crossed the lines. The Germans had sown the Hurtgen with mines, thousands of them. Shoe mines, small wooden boxes containing just enough explosive to tear off a foot, bouncing Bettys that leaped into the air before detonating at waist height. Anti-tank teller mines buried in the roads and trails. The mines were impossible to detect. The wet leaves covered them. The mud concealed them. Men stepped on them without warning. Vehicles drove over them without warning. The casualty rate from mines exceeded anything the American Army had experienced. Entire platoons were rendered combat ineffective, not by enemy fire, but by the cumulative attrition of mine strikes. Medical aid stations overflowed with men missing feet, missing legs, bleeding from wounds that no amount of training could prepare a soldier to treat in the field. Curtis Cullen stepped on a shoe mine on November 24, 1944. The explosion was small by military standards, barely audible beyond 50 yards. The mine contained only 200 grams of TNT, but 200 grams was enough. The blast shattered Cullen's left leg below the knee. He fell into the wet leaves and forest debris, staring at what remained of his leg, understanding in that moment that his war was over. Medics reached him within minutes. They applied a tourniquet, injected morphine, loaded him onto a stretcher. The evacuation took hours. Every step through the forest risked another mine. The bearers moved slowly, carefully, trying to follow paths that had already been cleared while carrying a man who was going into shock. He was evacuated from the forest, from Europe, from the war, while his Rhino tanks continued to serve across the continent, while American forces pushed toward Germany using techniques his invention had made possible. Cullen lay in a hospital bed learning to walk with a prosthetic limb. The man who had solved the hedgerow problem was 29 years old. He would never serve in combat again. Cullen returned to the United States in early 1945. The rehabilitation process took months. Learning to walk on a prosthetic leg in 1945 was a different experience than it would be today. The technology was primitive. The prosthetics were heavy, uncomfortable, and prone to causing sores. Many amputees simply gave up and spent their lives in wheelchairs. Cullen refused. He practiced walking until he could do it without a cane. He refused to let the Hurtgen take anything more from him than it already had. He married Bernice Enright shortly after the war ended. The wedding was small, quiet, attended by family and a few friends from his old unit. There were no newspaper reporters. The hero of the hedgerows had been replaced in the public imagination by newer heroes, newer victories. The war had moved on. They settled in New York City, in an apartment in Greenwich Village. Cullen took a job with his old employer, Schenley Industries. He was no longer arranging window displays. He worked as a liquor salesman, traveling the city, meeting with distributors and retailers. The work was steady. It paid the bills. It asked nothing of him except showing up and doing his job. He did not talk much about the war. When people asked, he deflected. He mentioned Roberts. He mentioned the men who had died in the hedgerows before the solution was found. He did not mention his own role with any enthusiasm. He did not mention the mine, or the leg, or the months of rehabilitation. The Legion of Merit sat in a drawer somewhere. The newspaper clippings yellowed and were forgotten. The Rhino device itself evolved after the war. Lockheed and other defense contractors studied Cullen's improvised design and developed standardized versions for future conflicts. Tank dozer blades, mine plows, and breaching equipment all traced their lineage to those steel prongs cut from German beach obstacles in a French apple orchard. The principle Cullen had discovered, that a tank could plow through obstacles if its nose was kept down, became standard military doctrine. The Korean War came and went. Cullen watched it on television, watched tanks that incorporated lessons from his invention fight in terrain very different from Normandy. He did not comment. He did not write letters to the newspapers explaining what he had contributed. He simply watched and remembered and said nothing. The British produced their own versions of the hedgerow cutter, calling them prongs. Over 2,000 were manufactured and fitted to Sherman tanks across the European theater during the war. The design spread to other vehicles, other armies, other conflicts. Every modern combat engineering vehicle carries some echo of the solution. A window dresser from New Jersey improvised when the experts said the problem was unsolvable. Curtis Cullen lived quietly in New York City for 18 years after the war. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, honoring an ancestor named Colonel Curtis Grubb, who had fought in the Revolutionary War. The family had a tradition of military service stretching back to the founding of the nation. Curtis Grubb, Cullen III, had added his own chapter to that tradition, though he rarely spoke of it. He raised no children. He and Bernice lived their quiet life in Greenwich Village, far from the battlefields of France and the forests of Germany. He sought no recognition. He gave no interviews. When the 20th anniversary of D-Day approached in 1964, journalists contacted veterans across the country for commemorative stories. Cullen declined to participate. He watched the anniversaries come and go without attending commemorations. He did not join veterans organizations or march in parades. The war had taken his leg and 4 months of his life and friends whose names he still remembered. He had given enough. He did not owe the war anything more. On November 20th, 1963, Curtis Grubb Cullen III died in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The cause of death is not recorded in surviving documents. He outlived his moment of fame by nearly 2 decades, but he did not outlive his injuries by much. 48 is young to die, even for a man who had stepped on a German mine. The obituaries were brief. They mentioned his invention, the Legion of Merit, the contribution to the Normandy campaign. They noted that he had been wounded in the Hurtgen Forest. They did not mention Private Roberts. They did not mention the 18 years of anonymous life in New York City, while history moved on without him. They did not mention that he had tried, again and again, to share credit for an invention that bore only his name. Bernice Cullen survived her husband by many years. What she did with his medals, his papers, his memories is unknown. No archive holds the Curtis Cullen collection. No museum displays his personal effects. He passed through history like a stone through water, leaving ripples that spread far beyond his own life, but taking his personal story with him when he sank. The Rhino tanks are gone now. The Shermans that carried Cullen's devices were scrapped after the war or sent to other countries as military surplus. A few survive in museums, their hedgerow cutters displayed as curiosities from a forgotten phase of a war that ended 8 decades ago. Most visitors walk past without understanding what they are seeing. But the legacy endures in ways that Cullen never imagined. Every modern army has specialized breaching vehicles designed to overcome obstacles. Every military engineering manual includes sections on improvised solutions to field problems. The principle that Cullen proved in July 1944, that sometimes the best ideas come from the lowest ranks and the simplest observations, is taught in officer training programs around the world. The hedgerows of Normandy are still there. They still divide the French countryside into the same ancient pattern that stopped the American advance for 5 weeks in the summer of 1944. Farmers still maintain them, still plant crops in the fields they surround. Tourists drive past without knowing they are looking at terrain that almost extended World War II by a year or more. And somewhere in those hedgerows, if you know where to look, you can still find the holes. Places where the earth was disturbed, where the root systems never fully recovered, where a Sherman tank burst through 8 decades ago with steel prongs on its nose and a crew that finally had a chance to fight back. The walls have grown over, the scars have healed, but the ground remembers. Private Roberts went home to Tennessee after the war. What happened to him is unknown. His name does not appear in any official record of the Rhino device. His contribution exists only in the accounts of Curtis Cullen, who kept trying to share the credit with a man the publicity machine had erased. The Army did not keep track of enlisted men's casual suggestions during maintenance bull sessions. No one wrote down what Roberts said or when he said it. No one documented the laughter that followed. By the time historians started asking questions, Roberts had vanished into the anonymity that swallowed most of the 16 million Americans who served in World War II. Perhaps Roberts lived a long life. Perhaps he married, had children, worked a trade. Perhaps he told his family about the idea he had one night in Normandy, the joke that a sergeant took seriously. Perhaps he watched the anniversary specials on television and saw his solution credited to someone else. Perhaps he pointed at the screen and said, "That was my idea." And perhaps his family believed him, or perhaps they did not. Perhaps he did not mind. Some men do not need recognition. Some men are content to know that their idea mattered, even if their name was forgotten. The hedgerows fell. The war ended. American boys came home who would have died climbing those ancient walls. If Roberts knew that his joke had saved lives, maybe that was enough. Or perhaps Roberts died young, as so many veterans did. Perhaps he stepped on a mine in the Hurtgen, like Kulin, or caught a sniper's bullet in the Ardennes, or succumbed to wounds that seemed minor at the time, but festered into something fatal. The war killed men in ways that were not always obvious. Some died decades later from injuries they never fully healed. Some died from memories they could not escape. We will never know what happened to Private Roberts of Tennessee. His story ends the moment the laughter stopped and Kulin picked up a pencil. After that, he is a ghost, a footnote, a name that might not even be his real name. Historians have searched, journalists have asked, no one has found him. The lesson of Curtis Cullen and Private Roberts is not about tanks or hedgerows or military engineering. It is about listening. Every officer in the American Army had heard complaints about the bocage. Every engineer had studied the problem. But when a Tennessee private with no formal education suggested putting saw teeth on the tanks, they laughed. Cullen did not laugh. He listened. He took an absurd idea and made it work. And because he listened, thousands of American soldiers lived who would otherwise have died climbing hedgerow walls with their bellies exposed to German rockets. That is how innovation happens in war, not through committees or planning sessions or engineering reviews, through sergeants who listen to privates, through mechanics who modify systems that the engineers say cannot be modified, through men who see problems every day and refuse to accept that the problems are unsolvable. Curtis Cullen was not a genius. He was not an engineer. He was a window dresser from New Jersey who paid attention when other men were laughing. That was enough. That was everything. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about sergeants who solved impossible problems with scrap metal and determination. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Curtis Cullen and the forgotten Private Roberts do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.